Have you ever been stressed out by worry? Has worry ever convinced you that something bad was going to happen that never actually happens? Let me tell you about a time when I got up close and personal with worry. A number of years ago, I was presenting a workshop at a conference. As I began to speak, I tripped over my words and immediately had a shame attack. I obsessed about how badly I messed up. I was terrified that everybody in the audience was judging me as harshly as I was judging myself. And it took everything I had to stay on task because I felt enormously foolish. Many of you know this experience of how quickly calm can flip into fear. It wasn't a fun time at all, as you can imagine. Heat flooded me, my heart was racing, adrenaline and cortisol were shooting like geysers in my brain, getting my body to be shaky, just at the moment that I most needed to be calm and steady. Somehow, I got through and I pulled off the talk. On day 2 of the conference, Beth Weinstock, my work partner at the Resilience Group, asked about my night. "Oh God," I said. I went home and regaled my husband with just how badly I messed up. Suddenly, I noticed Beth's face went blank. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said. Instantly, I realized I was so under the spell of my inner critic that I never even checked in with her. She was in the room. She heard me talk. She could have given me perspective. Why didn't I ask? Quite simply, I believed my inner critic. That's how it works. The inner critic is the voice of authority. It's certain of what it thinks. There's no question marks. There's no doubts. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It simply judges. Beth and I stood there in shock, staring at one another, saying, "How can this happen? How can you be prepared and confident and in a flash, out of nowhere, be hijacked into intense levels of self-doubt, insecurity, and fear-based thinking with the most negative of storylines?" Well, we've discovered that being confident and self-assured is insufficient. It doesn't shield us from the power of this limbic system of ours. That's our emotional brain. At any moment in time, a switch can get flipped and activate us into high levels of anxiety and panic. So you might wonder what helps. Well, what helps is actually to get to know the nature of this emotional brain of ours, to get to know how it actually exaggerates how bad things are, how it predicts terrible things are going to happen, and how it criticizes, shames, and blames us. Why does it do this? Why would our brain do this to us? You might think it's some kind of cruel joke. Ironically, it's built in as a way of protecting us, not harming us. But it doesn't always work that way. Way back when we were in our earliest development as human beings, we were up against four-legged tigers. We didn't have claws and we didn't have teeth to defend ourselves. We had a brain. Our brain signaled us with alerts to threats and dangers by getting us to smell, by getting us to hear sounds, getting us to freeze in place and run for cover. We're no longer up against four-legged tigers. We're up against two-legged paper tigers in the form of people. We're afraid of what people are going to say about us, and we're afraid of what they're going to think of us. Many of you know that the field of neuroscience is burgeoning with new discoveries. They all confirm one fact, that we cannot simply think our way out of fear. The neurochemical reaction is far too powerful, and it overrides the mind's ability to think reasonably and rationally. It makes sense if you think about our experience. With fear-based thinking, the brain fires up in ways that are similar to a smoke alarm going off, despite there being no smoke. The alarm goes off and we start to get worried. We start looking around to try to figure out what's wrong. And by the time we figure out there's no fire, this was a false alarm. We're all stirred up with worry and anxiety. That's the workings of our inner worrier in a nutshell. That inner worrier doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's got a support system, and that's the inner critic. Think for a moment. How do parents train children to be safe? We don't talk in gentle tones of voice. Instead, we intentionally try to scare our kids. We say things like, "Don't touch that hot stove, you're going to get burned. Don't run out into the street, you're going to get killed." And as kids, what do? We imitate our parents' tones of voice. We repeat their words over and over and over again until by 4 years old, this inner critic voice gets hardwired into our brain, and it remains there for life. The inner critic, it doesn't only scare us, it also blames us. As young children, for any reason that we become frustrated, the inner critic insists it must be our fault. It makes up stories to explain disappointments and frustrations. At first, the stories are pretty simple. It must be me. There must be something I'm doing to cause this. And as we get language, we elaborate. You're too pushy. That's why you didn't get invited to the party. You're too needy. That's why mom's not paying any attention to you. You're too loud. That's why the kids in the playground are laughing at you. And as we get more language, we elaborate even more with all fiction stories. We live under the influence of emotionally based stories, and we don't even know it. We think they're truths. We think that they're telling it like it is, but they're not. They're myths. It's exactly what happened to me at the conference. In a split second, my mind created this fear-based story that terrified me because I thought it was accurate. We're all under the influence because we all have this brain that's got a negativity bias built in for basic survival. So what are we going to do about it? Because we have to get smart about how to take charge of this inner critic and the inner worrier. Well, consider what we do these days with our emails. We've had to develop a skeptical eye and an ear for noticing what comes across our screen, even those things that might seem reasonable. Because what happens if we don't? We get scammed, and our computer's at risk of getting a virus. Well, the same is true for our emotionally based stories. We get scammed, and then we suffer. So, we need to protect ourselves, and in order to do that, we need what Beth and I call an inner coach. An inner coach is that part of the mind that's reasonable and rational. The inner coach recognizes that we all have an inner critic that shames and blames us. And we all have an inner worrier that generates worst-case scenarios and creates these stories that scare us. The inner critic reminds us to take a deep breath and slow down the body and the mind. It also helps us to picture an imaginary remote control and click on pause and mute the negative self-talk. The inner coach helps us to separate fact from fiction, to resist taking things personally, and to speak to ourselves in an encouraging and supportive, positive voice. Easier said than done, right? Absolutely. A client of mine was terrified about asking for a raise. She had all the reasons in her mind why she couldn't do it. And I said to her, you gotta do this. There's no choice about it. Because if you don't ask, no one's gonna come to you and offer you money, so you need to request it. We discussed how her inner coaching voice could practice saying to herself, it's okay to be scared, not a problem, and you're gonna need to do this anyway. You may feel like this is a real bold act. Go for it. You're needing to do it and you can do it. Go for it. Another client was in anguish over not hearing back from his colleague he had emailed. We discussed how his inner coach could say to him, "Stop taking this personally. You have no idea what's going on in this person's life. All you know is that you need them more than they need you right now. So your job is to be persistent, stick with it, and don't give up so easily." For some of us, it helps to write down the words of our positive self-talk. For others, it helps to say those words out loud and hear ourselves speak. It may feel awkward, but if you think about it, most anything we've ever done in our lives has started out with the willingness to tolerate feeling awkward. So, we need to practice, because if we don't, then fear gets us. To protect ourselves, we need to manage fear so that fear doesn't manage us. In order to do that, we need to follow 3 steps. We need to hear our inner critic and our inner worrier, because if we don't hear them, we can't do anything about them. 2, we need to recognize the stories and the fiction that they spin. And 3, we need to resist giving credibility to those inner stories. When we practice these 3 steps over and over and over again, we get to empower ourselves with more courage. We get to boost self-confidence. We get to sustain a much greater sense of well-being and fortify resilience. Thank you.